In my head is like, if you choose to have a boundary, but then you also choose to have it flexible, then why do you have boundaries in the first place? Because you're giving opportunities for people to cross that boundary.
Hello, it's Sam.
And I'm Amelia.
Welcome back to Us Duo Podcast where we aim to build a better mindset for better relationships.
This week, we are going through the relationship with boundaries. So this one came across my mind. I was talking about it with you in terms of like when we have boundaries, sometimes you can see that people are flexible with their boundaries and some people are very dead set on their boundaries. So how do you find the balance or find a good relationship between having rigid boundaries or being flexible or adaptable?
That's a fucking good question, my friend.
It goes real deep because it's really goes down into the sense of your self-worth, how much you understand yourself.
Well, I mean, to begin with, it's got to be healthy, a healthy boundary. There's a clear definition between healthy and unhealthy boundaries, but boundaries in general, I think we definitely need to have.
And this topic, just boundaries itself, is something that's been coming up a lot, especially in this era, post-COVID situation where people really did have to find their own boundaries and realize that they don't have time for themselves or they just don't have a good work-life balance and non-negotiables. So how do we really find these boundaries and set them in stone?
To begin, you've got to really self-reflect on what best suits you depending on your situation. Whether it's for you personally, whether it's for your relationship, whether it's for your work, you've got to really dig deep as to what you need to set in place.
Yeah. So rather than talking in the perspective of like for other people, for yourself, what is your purpose of setting boundaries?
My purpose of setting boundaries is really a set rule or a guideline or a law that I have in place to really help me keep on track in terms of defining what my limits are for doing something. So that's how I see it. What about yourself?
So how I see it, like why I have boundaries, is really when you have these boundaries for yourself, it aligns other people, atmosphere, situations, and it aligns it with the way you want to live your life and the way that you want to see your life. And if you're trying to achieve something, how it aligns to get you to where you want to achieve. So these boundaries come in place for that purpose. So it's kind of like guidelines, kind of like when you're going bowling, there's like those little things on the side that you pull out. If you don't have those things on the side, the ball may go left or right and might go into the gutter. But if you have these things, which are the gutter that you pull out, these are your boundaries, the things that you fit inside or guidelines that you try to align your life with, and it will guide the ball straight.
Do you know what that thing is called?
No.
It's called the noob fence.
The what? It's
called the noob fence.
You just shamed everyone out there who use that.
It's like the people who use the little fucking rack thing. They put the ball in and it helps you roll.
Yeah. Well, not that, but I think the bowling rink, bowling alley, when you pull those things out, that's the boundaries.
Bowling rink?
Bowling
I just
alley.
thought, you know how skating rink?
It's a circle. Anyways, getting very off track. So that's my purpose of having boundaries and why I see people need boundaries, because it really helps determine what is and what's not okay for you personally. So this boundary can vary from person to person.
Yeah, I would say two main types of boundaries. And one is obviously your rigid and the other one is your flexible type of boundary. Now, when it comes to rigid boundaries, rigid is more those non-negotiable type of boundaries that you've got set in place that you always have and follow that.
Yeah, and then there's the flexible ones. So the flexible ones are like depending on the situation or maybe depending on the person that you're talking to, you're dealing with, you may sway a little bit and allow a bit of those things to happen. Whereas like in some certain cases, you definitely don't allow it. So I wanted to go through this because this really interests me in terms of I've always thought of boundaries as a non-negotiable. Like this is set in stone, you don't mess with it. But then I was thinking like for people on the other end of the spectrum who has no boundaries, very flexible, very okay with things, then you might see them fall into common situations where they're like, why does this always happen to me? It's maybe because they always say yes to things, don't say no enough. So how do we find a balance, and how do you know for yourself, like not really to share our like you need to do this, like for ourselves, how do we find what is a rigid boundary for us and what is a flexible?
That's actually a pretty hard one to answer, because setting the boundary that's right or optimal for you, that is defined as whether it's rigid or flexible. I think it just really comes down to what you're trying to rectify. So in as an example, for my rigid boundary would be when it comes to relationships, friendships, and how to communicate and stuff like that, or just people, right? Just how to communicate. I treat the communication very much like a two-way street. So whatever you dish on someone, you've got to be able to reap it back, and it's a two-way street.
But what
So
do you mean?
what I mean by that is basically, if you were to give me shit and I were to give you shit, you have to take it. Whereas there are a lot of people out there that I have experience where they'll give you a lot of shit, and when I give them shit back, they can't handle it.
Hmm.
So to me, that's a rigid type of boundary I have, where you've got to be able to take what you give.
But for you, why have you set that as a non-negotiable boundary, like a rigid one?
Yeah. So to me, I've set that as a non-negotiable boundary because it helps me determine the characters that I deal with or the friendships that I make, because I want to surround myself with people who are able or who are capable of actually being able to communicate in a certain way, portray a certain way to certain people, but also retrieve and be able to handle it.
So I'm just trying to pick apart. Have you ever met someone or have a friend that you have in your friend zone? I mean, in your friend category, where they give you shit, you give them shit, but maybe your level of giving them shit is not as harsh as they give it to you. Like, maybe are you flexible in that way? Or does it have to be equally, like, say you guys are both just as harsh to each other?
No, I think in that instance of defining how harsh you give each other shit, that can be flexible. But I think just holistically, it's more about if you give me shit and I give you shit,
And then cry and run away?
and they if they complain and say, "Oh, you did this and that," and he's like, "Well, hang on, you started it."
It's kind of that concept of treat others how you want to be treated, right? That
Yeah,
concept.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I can see why that's one. A rigid one for me would be, yeah. So a rigid one for me, this is something that I've always developed, is how much I share personal, like deep, deep personal thoughts with other people. And if I can see that people are unwilling to share, not saying that it has to be transactional where like you give me one deep story, I give you a deep story, but it's a collaboration of how they listen, how willing they are to give you their time and all that. And if they're not willing to give me any of that, then I'm not going to share deep stories as well. Because not saying I have trust issues, but I hold on to who I trust really carefully because I have gone through a whole lifetime of just a lot of untrustworthy people. And I can see the real dark side of how people can portray themselves as trustworthy, portray themselves as giving you the honest truth, but they really aren't. So I hold on to that as a non-negotiable, is how much I trust in people.
I do relate to that because there is a lot of shit people out there, and it's very hard to, I guess, gain that trust unless they reflect. It's like same thing as what my rigid boundary is. It's a two-way street. They have to show that trust for me to show that trust in other aspects as well, right?
Yeah, so that's one hard boundary for me. But this is just like a respect thing that comes from me and just something that I've always done. This is also, I guess, a hard or rigid boundary for me, is like always ask before you use someone's stuff. That's like a big sign of respect. And I can see if people don't do that, it can come across as disrespectful. And to me, even if it's like close friends or someone that you really know, I still make that effort to ask because it could be, in their sense, something important to them or very personal to them. And you never know that. As much as you may know that person, it doesn't hurt to just ask. Like, it's like a 2 sentence thing, or one sentence like, hey, are you okay if I use this? Or like, can I just borrow this for a second? And to me, I can gauge a lot of how much respect I have for others by doing that.
What if that person asks you if they can borrow that stuff?
Yeah, then that's fine. Like, I can see that that's respectful. Like, it doesn't have to be an ask. Even at least it's like, hey, I'm just going to use this for a sec. Like, just letting you know. Whereas, like, if you just take something or just use something without telling them,
That's a bit dirty. Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know how to explain it, but to me it's disrespectful.
Yeah. I just had that story of you lending me your phone, your Sony Ericsson.
I didn't learn that, I gave it to you.
Yeah. I don't know why you gave it to me. I was like, what the hell's going on? But yes. Yeah.
Well, no, you do know because you're like, hey, you're not using it. Can I have it? And
No, I can't use it.
no, he's like,
Yeah,
can I
you
have
can't
it?
use it, and then you're like, you have it, and I was
You
like,
said,
oh
can
shit.
I have it? I gave it to you. But that's not asking. That's like a whole different story.
Yeah.
But to me, I can see a whole lot of personality in how much you respect someone by asking or telling them, because it's a really small gesture that you can do, but it has such a massive impact because it's so small that it really is just a case of, hey, can I use this? Or hey, I'm just going to borrow this for a second. And if you don't even have the effort or the desire to do that and relay a message or send a message, then that shows a lot about that person.
To flip it to flexible boundary, I think one that we have as a joint, I thought I'd throw it out there anyway, is our flexibility for gym. So going to gym at a certain period or certain time. I know we used to have quite a rigid structure for that back in the day. We used to be very much like this day, this particular time, anything, any event happening during that time was a dead set no. But now we're very much like, yeah, whatever.
Well, we're more flexible and we can change our times around our own personal stuff rather than being, this is a non-negotiable. We don't go out on Fridays because we're going to gym, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely in the earlier times, that was very rigid, but now it's very much, yeah, let's go, let's hang out.
Actually, while we're speaking of flexible boundaries, one that I can see that I have is personal time. So I am introverted in the sense that if I had a big day, if I had a lot on, I would like to have some time alone, just at home or just spending time by myself. And the reason why I say this is flexible because sometimes I might like to end the day with hanging out with friends and that's me unwinding. But sometimes I really most cases I would like to spend time alone. So that one's like flexible because I'm not like as soon as I get home, like, whoa, don't talk to me. I just need to just sit, be by myself. I'm not like that. So I can see this as a flexible boundary. It's like as long as I can spend time alone in the way that I want to at that point in time, that's my non-negotiable.
Yeah, nice. I was thinking back, I was just trying to think. There was a boundary that was rigid for me, and this is the not going out during the weekdays until a certain period of time. But I realized that now I'm more open or more susceptible. No.
This is sounding worse and worse.
Now I'm more
susceptible.
Yeah, susceptible, more acceptable.
Anyway,
flexible. It's what?
Flexible.
Yeah, more flexible to.
I don't know where this conversation is going.
Well, okay, backtrack. Yeah, I'm more flexible to consider going out during the weekday.
So why did you have it in the first place as a rigid boundary and why have you changed it now?
Yeah, I think initially I had a rigid boundary because it was just a set routine. It was very much like, okay, I need to make sure that it's a weekday. I've got work the next day or next morning. So I want to make sure that I'm well rested. I'm not doing shit. And I think it was also like a downtime period for me too, because obviously you work fucking 8 hours a day. And then the after hours is more like your
alone time.
Yeah, your refresh period.
Mm.
But now I'm like, okay, well, life has changed a bit here. I'm okay to do things and venture out during,
like hang out for dinner.
Yeah.
That's good. I think it's a good one. That's also something that I've changed. It wasn't a boundary for me. It was just a way of life and a scheduling thing that I've had in my mind. I was also the same Monday to Friday, work purposes, Saturday, Sunday, leisure purposes. And it was always like that. And the reason why it's changed is like, one, we do podcasts on Sundays, so that's already a big chunk of our time. But also it's like I question myself, like, why does it have to be on weekends? That includes us going grocery shopping. Like, why did it have to be on weekends? So opening up where we allow ourselves to do other things so that we can fill out our weekends more purposefully rather than bulking everything onto the weekend, then you're rushing again. You don't really have yourself time. So realigning that to just your lifestyle at that point in time, which leads to a really good point because someone wrote an article. Her name was Jordan Diorio, whatever. And she also said that boundaries are like seasons because what you set as a boundary last year may not be a boundary this year. So there are some good examples that we've already shown in terms of flexibility or even boundaries where we've shifted and changed what our boundaries are because it's a new season for us, it's a new time, and what we're doing and our life goals at that point in time changes. So yeah, I think like boundaries can change.
Yeah. Yeah. Boundaries can change. And it's just a part of life, like you mentioned too. So while we're on the topic of boundaries, though, non-negotiables come up. So can we talk about like what is the differences really between boundaries and non-negotiables?
Yeah, so that's something I mentioned earlier in the episode. I always saw boundaries as like a dead set thing. So I thought boundaries are non negotiables. Or as I was researching this, I'm like, hang on. So isn't boundaries just meaning non negotiables? But until I read that there's actually different types of boundaries, so the rigid versus the flexible, then I realized that boundaries aren't always non negotiables because non negotiables are a component of it. You definitely have this set in stone so that no one can cross this line and no one can mess with this non-negotiable because this is something that you really need for yourself to be a better person.
Yeah. And even for me, when I thought of boundaries, I thought it was very deep set ways of thinking. But as I looked into it, it was very much like boundaries can be anything. Boundaries are anything that you set under your own guideline, under
It's
your
like
own.
limits that you set for yourself.
Yeah. And it can be anything from small to big. And that's why it forms into two types of boundaries where it's rigid and where it's flexible.
So now that you understand the definition, do you see boundaries in a different light now?
For sure. Because like I said, I always thought that it was this is the land in the sand and you don't fucking
The land
cross
in
it.
the sand.
The land in the sand, the line in the sand that you can't cross.
Mm. I'm just thinking in myself, do I change that definition in my own head? Because in my head is like if you choose to have a boundary, but then you also choose to have it flexible, then why do you have boundaries in the first place? Because you're giving opportunities for people to cross that boundary. So in my head is like I kind of lean towards us having boundaries as rigid and also having it as non-negotiables because you have those limits for a reason and you set up boundaries for a reason. And I say this because I'm quite a flexible person in general. I'm very okay with most of the things. And the reason why I have boundaries and hard boundaries is really to protect myself. So if I want to protect myself, I need to have these hard boundaries so that I don't I don't overwhelm myself. I don't burn out. I don't stress. I don't
Don't
all
hurt
that kind
yourself.
of thing.
Yeah.
So that's why in my eyes, I feel like my boundaries mostly will remain as a rigid boundary as opposed to having flexible ones.
Yeah. And I mean, you could say rigid boundaries are pretty much your non-negotiables as such. And I think for an example, like when I look at relationships, it's very much like for me, you have your first date and you won't do certain things with that.
Like kiss on the first
Yeah,
date
it's
or
like you won't
something.
sleep with the person on the first date or something like that. But then there's some people who don't have those boundaries who are very much like, yeah, let's rock on. Let's go home, get a jiggy.
Well, like if you're putting it in that sense, that's the same with me. Like again, quite flexible. But the reason why I may put in those boundaries, like I don't kiss on the first date, is really because there's a reason for that. And I think if I allow those things to happen, then I'm not being true to myself and I'm not protecting my own boundaries because you're letting it happen. So that it might get carried away, it might happen more than once, more than twice, and then that boundary becomes not a boundary.
Yeah.
So that's why in my eyes, even though technically speaking, there may be different types, but in my eyes, I would like to keep my boundaries as rigid.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when you talk about boundaries, it really goes into other questions like, people who don't have boundaries and healthy and unhealthy boundaries.
Yeah. So there is a saying, anyone who doesn't respect your boundaries doesn't respect you. What do you think about that statement? Now that you also hear that there are flexible boundaries.
I mean, I think it's subjective to a certain point because it depends on what the boundary is that person is trying to cross. Now, if it's a boundary that is a rigid, non-negotiable, then it's very much like, hey, you're crossing that line. That's not cool. Whereas if it's a boundary where you know to yourself that it's, you can work with it. You're flexible a bit. It's kind of like that sleeping with someone on the first date. That could be something that you're flexible with. You could be like, okay, I enjoy this person. I'm getting with them. Like, as in,
No, but like this is coming across where they don't respect it. So they'd be like, why the hell do you have that boundary in the first place? Like, why would you do that? That's stupid kind of thing. Then does that mean that they don't respect you?
well, yeah, I would say, yeah, they probably just don't respect you as a person.
Hmm.
If you're telling them all these things and they're straight up saying, haha, why do you have that? That's stupid.
In my eyes, just to go back to this statement, anyone who doesn't respect your boundaries doesn't respect you. I'm trying to think in a deeper level. I don't think that they don't necessarily not respect you, but it may not be a person that I want to be associated with, and they may show other characteristics that doesn't align with you. So whether or not they respect you, that's a whole different question. But this statement does seem true a little bit, where I would rather keep this person at arm's length. And if you don't respect it, doesn't mean that they don't respect you, but they definitely have this characteristic where they're like, I'll do whatever I want.
Long guard that bitch. Have you heard of that?
Keep them away.
Have you ever heard of that? Check yourself before you respect yourself. Was it the other way?
The hell, check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yeah.
It's a whole different thing. Not even the right. What are you talking about?
Brain's dead. Brain's dead.
Brain's fried. But yeah, so I wouldn't say that if people don't respect your boundaries, it's not that they don't respect you. They just don't have a trustworthy personality that I would like to personally bond with. So I would be more careful.
Yeah, fuck that. Flick that bastard away.
So going back to all the stuff that we've talked about with yourself, how would you find a good balance between setting hard boundaries as opposed to being more flexible with it? Like where would you draw the line where you're like, I'll be okay with this, and then where it's like a hard no?
To me, you've got to really consider this is a hard no. I have to hold myself accountable, or I need to put these set boundaries in place where it's protecting myself. Like as you reflect, that's what you're going to really figure out. Okay, this is a non-negotiable, as opposed to something where you're like, oh, yeah, I'll have a boundary here, but depending on the scenario and the situation, I'm okay to cross that boundary, or I'm okay to stick with that boundary and actually setting that point. Now, for an example, like me, my non-negotiable is it's a two-way street. If you can't have a conversation with me where maybe you might give me shit and I give you shit back and then you go crazy, you can't give people shit but not take shit back. So that's something that you would have to sit down and reflect and think, okay, well, if I were to put myself in that position, is that something I would really set in stone and say, I don't want to deal with things like that, or I don't want to deal with people like that? Then that's when you would say, okay, that could be someone or something that you can set as a non-negotiable.
I think also in that context, it's like knowing that person as well. Like a good example is just like me and you. Like we give each other shit, but I would say your level of giving shit is a lot harsher than what I would give to you. But it's the flexible and I'm okay with it because it's not a non-negotiable for me, but it's how you treat people and how you talk to people is also a big thing for me. So you could say that that could be a boundary. But the reason why I'm more flexible, or it's not really a boundary in that sense, is because you really are, your characteristic is just you're joking, that's just how we are. It's just like the banter side of things. So that's like the flexible, and just knowing the other person and how much they give shit and how much they can take it.
Yeah. And that could be a different story for someone else. Like someone else might not like the giving shit, or they may not like someone that takes jokes to the extreme. So it's really just setting the boundary based off what you personally feel is, suitable for yourself.
Yeah. And I think this one's not one of ours, but a big one that people, especially back in the days, I think being on time and punctual is such a big thing. So when you're not punctual, when you're not on time, it could be seen as a bad thing. But over time, over the eras of life, people are becoming more flexible with being late. So I think this is a good boundary to bring up because, say, for example, you're friends with someone who's a new parent and they are just adjusting to time, adjusting to figuring out how to get a baby at a house, how to pack up, and they may be late more constantly than others. So you have to understand their time and situation and be okay that they will be late, even though you're like, hey, let's meet up at 9 o'clock and go have a coffee, whatever. But understand that they might be 10 to 15 minutes late.
Another one to think about is I read something on Reddit about boundaries.
Reddit.
And there was someone that was talking about how they've had to set boundaries on one of their parents because one of the parents was basically taking advantage of them to the point where it was hurting them, whether it was for money, whether it was for just taking advantage of this particular person. And at the end of the story, they just set limits on whether they continue to have contact with that particular parent or they completely lost contact with that person. So, like, as an example of that, it just depends on the scenario and the situation as to what it is, where you've got to really reflect and say, okay, is this something that is really hurting me or is it really affecting me where I have to put a boundary in there?
Mm. It all comes down to the reason, like when you're setting these boundaries, comes down to how much you need it and how much you need it to protect yourself. And then why do you have these boundaries in the first place is really good questions to ask yourself. And then what type of boundaries do you need to put in place to be your best self?
Yeah. And then if you really want to look deeper, you've got to look at it from a perspective of, is the boundaries working in benefit for you? Because like I mentioned briefly, there are two forms of boundaries. There's unhealthy boundaries as well as healthy boundaries.
Mm. I think a good example of that, this is something that I had to trial and error. This is in a work sense. So a lot of people are looking at work-life balance. So work 9 to 5, I don't work outside of 5 p.m. When I first started, very fresh in the design industry, I worked all the time. Like if my project went over time, I needed to put in the extra time to work to come up with a concept, come up with a pitch. Am more than willing to put in the extra time to get this done because I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow, I wanted to get as much experience as I can. So there was a boundary there, but I was flexible with it because my purpose, my overall goal was to grow and learn. And then most recently, I went into more very rigid boundaries where after 5 o'clock, I close my laptop, never look at it again until 9 o'clock in the morning. So I did that, but then I was thinking after however long I've done it, I'm like, am I too rigid with this boundary? Because yes, having that work-life balance is important, but also considering the industry I'm in, sometimes campaigns or like due dates may come, and that means you need to work more just for that period of time. Not saying constantly, like constantly is a different story. Should I be more flexible in actually staying on for a bit longer and actually doing the work? So that's just another thing of understanding the purpose, what your goals are, and where you need to go. And should you be more flexible? Yeah. So overall, let's just wrap up because we shared so many points. Wrap up 3 points on tips in balancing between rigid boundaries versus flexible boundaries.
Yeah, I think the very important question to ask yourself when you're reflecting is, what are you trying to set those boundaries on?
Like,
As
what's
in,
it for?
what is it for? And what is it impacting you at this point in time? That will help determine whether it is a dead set rigid boundary or a non-negotiable, or if you can implement something that's more flexible.
Yeah. So I think when you say flexible, it's not just like an airy fairy. It's like, oh, today I feel like this, say yes. Today I don't feel like that, say no. It's more like, if this happens, I allow it to say yes. And if this doesn't happen, I'm going to say no. Like, still have these subcategories within the boundary so that when situations occur, it helps you be like, okay, I am okay with it, or let's say no to it.
Yeah, I think second point to also implement is think about whether the boundary is a healthy or a unhealthy boundary, because at the end of the day, as long as it impacts you positively, that's what you need to focus on. So yes, you might have a rigid boundary, you might have a flexible boundary, but at the end of the day, is it benefiting you? I think that's very important to think about.
Mm. I don't know if I'll put it in words of benefiting. It's just like helping protect you to where you want to be. Because sometimes when people hear benefiting, it's like, what am I getting out of it?
Well,
So I
yeah.
don't think of it in that way. It's just more like, is it really helping to protect you as your best self?
What's in best interest for you specifically
Yeah,
at that point in time?
I think that's a really good one. This last one really comes from my point of view because I know that we did say that there's hard boundaries and flexible boundaries, but if you really know yourself, like I say for me, I am already a flexible person, so I wouldn't have any flexible boundaries. So that's why I have boundaries for a reason, and these are to help me put things in place to help me be my better self. So if you're someone who are similar to me and you only have hard boundaries, that's okay. But if you're someone who has a bit of both, that's also okay.
Yeah. So that's our 3 tips to balance between the hard and flexible boundaries. Please let us know in the comments or even in the DMs whether you had other tips or alternatives that we may have missed.
Yeah, and if you are pro rigid boundaries or if you have a bit of both, let us know because this is just obviously coming from our perspective. We would love to hear from your perspective as well, so share it around.
That's right. Thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you in the next one.
Bye.
Peace.